the CDB. Professor Dungs, we thank you for taking the time out to do this feature address this morning, and I now want to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Chairman and Head of the Department of Economics, and good morning to all. Head of the Department of Economics and previous heads, I see Martin, and he was here, and Anne-Marie. Of course, my good and long-time friend, the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. It's always good to see you and hear you, especially hear you. All distinguished guests, I see my former colleagues, Terrence and Ronald, in the audience. It's good to know you can come out to hear me. I don't know why, but I'll be saying everything that you all know already, but that's the nature of the beast. And of course, Patrick, PK. When I got the invitation from Anne-Marie, I said, well, almost immediately, I think I responded by saying, no problem whatsoever. I'll be there, because PK and I go back a very long time. In fact, as you can see, we joined the university about the same time, 1 year ahead of him. I joined a year before him and retired a year before him. So we spent 37 good years together. And we taught econometrics in university for several years, and then we went into Salisis. We worked together. I was university director, I think, just before you came in. And in fact, I was responsible for him coming to Salisis, so he has to give me another drink for that. Anyhow, it's really truly a pleasure to be speaking at this conference. Over the years, I've always, unlike Anne-Marie, I had always promised myself to come to this conference, but every time it clashed with university meetings in Trinidad. I noticed this year the university meetings were a week before, so at least even if I was still at university, I would have been able to come. And although my office, as I said, was, when I left as PVC, it was in Trinidad, I never had the opportunity to come across and the thing. But I'm honored and seeing that although Anne-Marie 2030 is way ahead of us, we, those who are now retired, realize that it's not so far ahead, because we have this habit in university of thinking, well, we're going to retire in 2030 and don't plan for it. And when it does come on top of you, you realize, boy, I'm in trouble. I don't know. And I've seen a lot of colleagues who've done that. They defer, and then when they come to retirement, they start wondering, and they want economic advice, as you said, as to what to do and when not to do. But that's a different story. So I'm really honored and pleased and happy to be able to be here, and even more so because at this point in time, I should be at another function at K-Phil. They're honoring 70 graduates from K-Phil who have performed well over the years, and I think my name is somewhere in that list, but that's the nature of the beast. So I've had to ask my wife to sit in for me. I'm not sure how good she can do it, but I'll find out later on how she will do that one, and my son, of course. Anyhow, I thought that this is important it was important to be here, and as I said, I tried to stick as close as possible to the theme of the particular conference this year, which is economic development challenges, looking towards 2030. And the issue here, and the 2030 is interesting because when I first saw it at the invitation, the first thing that hit my mind was the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. That was the first thing that came to my mind, 2030. And then when I started to do the research, I realized that, well, Trinidad and Tobago has a plan 2030, and I got confused as which one you already meant. But I tried to work the two together, as you will see as the presentation goes, and we'll see how, well, you will tell me later on how it works out. Now, I've been given a very strict time frame. I see that the program is down to the minute, but I will try to stay within the time period that we have, although we started late. So, right. The presentation essentially will be in 5 parts. After some introductory statements, I want to look at the nature, remind us about what the economic development is all about, especially in its modern formulation. Then look at the development experience within the region over a couple of years, decades, and then look at the whole issue of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and then finish on the way forward for the Caribbean. I note that there will be a discussion after this presentation on the whole question of development challenges. Terrence, I understand you'll be involved, I think, so it'd be good to see what comes about. So I will have to answer any questions. They'll leave the questions to the panelists going forward. So what about the introductory statement I want to make? And the first thing I want to note is that over the past about over my lifetime, so to speak, because 7 decades is approximately my lifetime. One can say that the Caribbean has done very well in terms of its economic and social development when compared with other developing countries, to the point that the region is well regarded as internationally as a middle-income particular country. And that has caused some concern for us, and those who are familiar with the Barbados experience now with the problems that we're going through, access, for example, to World Bank funds has always been very constrained. And Barbados has graduated many years ago, and therefore the sort of special development assistance that comes to developing countries such as ours, Barbados has not been able to benefit significantly over the years, at least on concessionary basis. But yet, you find that although we perform well, we have some statements being made about the region, which tells us something is wrong. I start with Terence's statement about Trinidad and Tobago being an underachieving society, performing well below its power. There's the IDB in Rupa has also argued that the region has been suffering from a Caribbean cirrhosis. And that term now has taken root in relation to economic growth in the region. Others have said that the region is constrained essentially by what is called an anti-growth coalition. This is my friend Avi Prasad, of the old established businesses and public sector bureaucracy, which has constrained its growth and going forward. And I have done some work which suggests that we probably caught in a middle-income trap, and I will explain that in a little bit more detail later on. So whilst the per capita incomes of the region has really increased significantly over the years, and we have moved to that middle-income status, the question is therefore that what we find, however, is that in recent times there's been a slowdown in economic growth, and that has caused us some serious concern. And the question is, what have been the reasons that we can posit for the slowdown in economic growth in the region? Is it due to the policies that have been adopted by the governments? Is it the operation of the institutions of the economic development and management? Is it the institutional issues? Is it the geography of the region? And I put the geography here primarily because we suffer from various shocks, as Henri had indicated earlier. But also, we've compared ourselves with Singapore over the years, to say, therefore, that Singapore, in the case of Barbados, they were both at the same level in the 1960s, and Singapore has gone there, and we're still struggling at the bottom. And the question arises, is it because of the geography of the region where Singapore is being able to benefit strategically from being an entrepot? Or is it the behavior of the economic agents that we have? And I have to thank Terence for this thing. We like it so. I mean, I remember when I asked Terence for a copy of the book, he said to me, well, Andrew, this is not an economics book. I said, no problem. I said it's no problem because I was doing some reading up on behavioral economics. And when I read it and read what the book was about, I said, well, this might be useful for me to have a look at. And it turned out to be very useful, Terence. So, and you will speak a little bit more about that. But it raises a number of issues, which broadens the basis of economics as a social science. We tend to see it merely as and with due respect to PK, a quantitative mathematical thing, but really and truly there's a lot of behavioral issues there. And finally, is it due to the quality of the economic management and human resources that we have in the region? And these are questions we ask ourselves. And in the debate in development economics, we find ourselves asking ourselves, which one is important? And it is this argument in the broader literature as to, is it policies that are important? Is it institutions? Is it geography? And so forth and so on. So we have to find some underlying regions for that. So we'll deal with some of those questions as we proceed in the presentation. But what I find most interesting is that in recent years, is Ralph there? Oh, I didn't realize. Ralph Henry is in the audience, a long-time colleague. Welcome, Ralph. In recent years, several studies have been, and this is almost like, the banks and others have international institutions have found the Caribbean interesting. The IDB, CDB, the IMF, and so forth have been publishing a number of studies dealing with macroeconomic issues and development issues in the region. The last slide that I have, I outline some of those particular studies that are particularly useful. And I've drawn on some of those particular studies in the presentation itself. But let us first of all get a handle on what economic development is all about. And here I think I've considered it as a long-term and ongoing dynamic process whereby the economic, social, institutional mechanisms of a country operate in such a way that the level and the quality of living of the population essentially are improved over time. So there must be some improvement, not on the level that people think, but also the quality of life as we proceed. And it's very general in the sense that being a multidimensional concept, we not only think of economics alone, but also we think about non-economic factors. And this way, psychology, political science, sociology, culture, all those other things, I think. And I always refer back to, and Ralph, you'll be glad to hear this, Arthur Lewis. In the sense, therefore, if one reason, I keep telling people, it'd be good to go back to the old, especially these young students here, those large studies dealing with the whole question of development. And I will strongly suggest, although it was published just before I was born, Arthur Lewis's Theory of Economic Growth, I would suggest to many young people to reread that one. We would talk about Schumpeter's Theory of Economic Development, but also I think Lewis's one is even much better and more relevant to our situation here because it covers a lot of issues that we need to think. And of course, we have seen that the international agencies such as UNDP has therefore widened the concept of development to consider human development, which goes slightly beyond the economic issues to incorporate non-economic, by indicating that human development is a process of widening people's choices in terms of how they live, how long they live, what sort of knowledge they acquire, how they have access to resources to ensure that they live a decent life. And most importantly, and this is now becoming important in economics, giving people the freedom and opportunities to exercise their choices. The whole question of the capabilities of persons, or as Amartya Singh would have said, development as freedom. So, and in even more recent times, the development concept has been further widened to consider what is called the multidimensional progress, which not only looks at human development as defined just now, but incorporates issues dealing with the rights of people. So there's now a rights-based approach to development, and also the whole question of environmental sustainability, which underpins the Sustainable Development Goals. So, in a nutshell then, economic development, why is it the focus is economic, is a much broader and wider concept incorporating a number of elements which we as economists and as social scientists need to consider. It is not only economic growth as we understand it in its narrow context, but also focuses a lot on the improvement in the quality of life and also the ability to realize the full potential of persons. And that last part of it, I think, is pretty critical because in many cases, people have potential, and the question of whether or not the mechanisms, institutional and other mechanisms are there to allow them to realize that potential becomes particularly important. But of course, it takes, development, economic development is a long-term process, as I've indicated. And clearly, the path is what I call a nonlinear path. In a sense, therefore, it's not a straight line, very nice and smooth and so forth. It is nonlinear in the sense that there's an upward trend, and it requires leadership, provide that long-term vision as to where we're going, that's important, and of course management, economic management to make sure that we keep on track on that particular trend. So therefore, when we talk about the dynamics of development, we're not only talking about issues in terms of the long term, but also how we deal with short-term particular issues. And of course, having those multi-dimensions makes it very difficult to manage and to measure, and of course, to achieve, know whether or not we achieve or not. But we will make a try at it when I move to the whole question of measurement of the development process. Because at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, have we made any progress in the development in the region? And of course, this is very standard for most of you. In terms of the measurable features of the development process, we are talking about how per capita income is increasing and how, of course, how it's distributed over time, how the productive structure has been changed in question of diversification of economies, and I will speak about that diversification challenge later. Issues of how we innovate and develop entrepreneurship are in critical elements of the development process and it's part of a measurement. How importantly we reduce or eliminate in some case poverty and deprivation, inequality and unemployment, and of course how we enlarge people's choices, capabilities and freedoms via improvements in health, education and democratic participation. I want to pause there to say that as the head department had indicated earlier, Patrick has been involved in various aspects of these particular, and that's why when I started to prepare the lecture, I noted Patrick's involvement. He started as a pure econometrician, so to speak, teaching econometrics and mathematics and so on, And I've seen the gradual change to even to the point of now, I think, finishing off with climate change and sustainable development. So he's the full gamut of work, and some of the, especially in the area of measurement. And I want to emphasize that particular point. Why I got into, I really started my teaching in university, teaching development economics. That was my first assignment by the head. And I got very frustrated, really, by noting that there wasn't, the quantitative basis of it, it was a lot more talk than actual concrete basis for measurement. And I switched back to my original field, which was econometrics, and spent a good few years, and then came back to economics in terms of labor economics and human resource development economics in a way. So let's look at the development experience of the region in terms of some of the measurable elements. But I want to emphasize that while we can measure some particular elements of it, there are a lot of qualitative and almost intangibles that we must consider in the development process. And we've been trying over the years to quantify as many of these elements as possible. But as I indicated here, over the period 1980 to most recent, the economic growth of the region, as I said, has been characterized by a declining average growth rate. So if one looks at the growth rates, and I'll show you a chart in a moment, generally has been a downward slide in the economic growth of the region over time. In the early period, in the 1960s, we were talking about 4 and 5% growth rates. Now in the 1980s, we're talking about 3%. We got into the 1990s, we're into 2%. And in the year 2000s, we were talking about just about 1%. So we're seeing a general decline. In fact, I remember once, and I made a statement some time back, when I heard that Trinidad was growing at 1%. The IMF had made a statement that Trinidad was growing at a rate of 1%, and that was supposed to be a good rate. I smiled to myself. I said, well, if we regard 1% or thereabouts as being a good rate of growth, then you're really in the wrong world. But certainly what we've been experiencing in the region is this downward trend. And the question is why that is so. One can argue for a statistician that it might be a measurement issue. I don't think it could be totally that. It's certainly much more economic and other factors that are important in that regard. There's also the high degree of volatility in the growth rate. It is very choppy over time, and that is reason for that to a large extent is that there have been several shocks that the region has experienced over the period, both environmental and economic shocks, which have created challenges in that particular regard. In terms of economic shocks, certainly in terms of Trinidad and Tobago is well known for its boom and bust cycles, and therefore something we need to be able to iron out smooth out those particular cycles over time. But the slowdown itself, as I said, has been associated with what I term the middle income trap, and which is now well established in the literature, where we find that whilst countries have been able to make the transition from a low income to middle income status through diversification in the economies, in the case of Barbados, for example, we moved from agriculture into light manufacturing and services, and we were able to make that middle income shift. The moving or pushing to the high income level is a little more challenging, and that's why it's called the middle income trap. And the statistical analysis that I've done suggests, therefore, that we have that problem, and is related to some extent with the whole question of sectoral diversification or the sectoral diversification challenge, as I've indicated later on. In the area of human development, the region, as I said earlier, is now regarded as a high human development region as by the UN, the United Nations Development Program. And interesting enough that prior to the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009, Barbados and the Bahamas were in the very high human development category. If one looks at the historical record for the region, you'll find that after that shock, so to speak, Barbados moved from very high into just high alone. But in the most recent report, we've moved back into the very high category. And it raises some questions because given the economic challenges that Barbados, for example, will be experiencing, the question arises, is it really in the very high or really high? But certainly, the important thing is that we have been doing fairly well in relation to the Human Development Index, which relates essentially to the ability to live long, healthy life, acquisition of knowledge, and of course, enhancing our standard of living. And to a large extent, the high income, the high ratings that we've achieved in the region to a large extent have been due to what I would regard to the social capital that we've been able to develop over the years, or the social variables. And I've given you the evidence, some of the data here. You might not be able to see all of it, but certainly that gives you a sense of where the countries are. You can see with the exception of Ghana, and I don't include Haiti here, with the exception of Ghana, they're all in the high category in 2015. One would expect certainly, but by 2030, Ghana, if it does these things right, might very well be high or very high. I think the critical issue is how they manage their newfound wealth, so to speak, going forward, and something that we need to look at going forward to 2030. So that's the ranking to 2050. We have done well in that particular regard. When we look at the development transition, the movement and diversification issue and the competitiveness, if we use the World Economic Forum classification of development stages, 1, 2, and 3, we see therefore that Barbados and Trinidad have been transitioning from the stage 2, which is what is called the efficiency stage, which focuses a lot on the efficiency of production and quality of goods, to the innovation stage, where therefore you're now hitting the frontier of producing more sophisticated and innovative goods in the process. And if one looks at the index, let's say, in recent times, you see therefore where the region has performed fairly well in terms of its position. There's been some slippage, as you can see. In the case of Barbados, there's been a slippage from the rank of 41 out of 121 countries to 72 in 2016-17. And to a large extent, that is due to some difficulties that we've had in the recent years, this decade, within the countries. In fact, one can argue that the Great Recession, so to speak, has had a significant impact upon the development process within the Caribbean when one looks at the slippage that some of these countries have experienced. But to a large extent, we are moving towards innovation, and that now becomes an important element in relation to going forward in the region. In addition to the transition process at the macro level, these reports provide some useful information in relation to the challenges which we face in relation to the development process, or more specifically the growth and productivity process within the region. If one looks at the period 2013-2015, at the most problematic factors for doing business, which is important for the growth process within the region, we find that in the case of Barbados, there are a number of factors which have influenced there. Poor work ethic of the workforce, inefficient government bureaucracy, and so forth. Ghana, same time, corruption, taxes, Jamaica, crime and theft, Trinidad and Tobago, poor work ethic, and so on. As you can see from that, there's a common denominator in all of this. What is it? And I'm quite sure, Anne-Marie, will have to deal with this. Inefficient government bureaucracy has been identified as probably the main factor common to all the things. Now, the issue with this, having been involved in the preparation, Salisis certainly was involved in the preparation of some of these reports at one point in time. In many cases, the questions are asked of the private sector. What are the problems? And people who are not in the government sector. But there's never a question asked about, to a large extent, of persons in the public sector about what is really going on. And that is a bit of a bias I've considered in the particular analysis of these particular reports. Because there are intra-business challenges that need to be considered here as part of the process. But more importantly, what is coming out from this from a macro perspective is that certainly one of the challenges we have in the region for development, as I would indicate later, is the question of inefficiency in the government bureaucracy. And one of my colleagues in Barbados, a former governor of the Central Bank, has been on this case for a very long time about government bureaucracy and government inefficiency in the system. If I turn now to the socio-economic development, since it's important that as I said, the important thing here is to ensure that people live a good standard of living, and some social elements become important in this regard. The region certainly still has high levels of poverty in the region, where in most countries, poverty is in a region of over 20% of the population. I'll give you a table in a moment to go through that. If I look at inequality, it has been, there are moderate levels of inequality. Inequality, in many respects, we're seeing that governments have addressed elements of these by their fiscal measures, so that if one uses the Gini coefficient as a measure of inequality, income equality, where 0 speaks to perfect equality, most countries are under 0.04, and therefore suggesting that we are not in a high inequality region as some countries, some developed countries. There are significant levels of informality in the economies of the region, with in some cases over 30% of the GDP attributed to the informal sector, and I particularly will discuss that later on in relation to your own panel. High levels of unemployment, especially among the youth, and this has been a worrisome issue. No matter how you measure the unemployment in the region, you have this being a particular challenge. And of course, when it all boils down, socioeconomic variables have been more problematic, as I said here, to collect for the region. And I want to put a plug again for something that Patrick has been instrumental in developing a course, a degree program in development statistics along with Godfrey St. Bernard in Salises. I think when the proposal came to me as university director, I was very supportive of it, and I'm quite sure, I'm not sure how it's going now, but I suppose it's still going well, that we need to enhance our socioeconomic database a lot more. So to give you a sense of, can you see that? Yeah, to give you a sense of some of the measures of socioeconomic progress in the region, you see there in terms of poverty, from studies that have been done some are a bit dated, as you can see, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, but where we have cases where we have at least two data points, you can see that in the case of Bahamas, it has increased. In Barbados, it has increased. In Guyana, it has increased. In Jamaica, margin basically the same. And in case of Suriname, which is an interesting result, it has decreased, and I need to check on that particular one. But in Trinidad and Tobago, there seems to be some increase over the two broad data points. So we have a challenge in respect to, in relation to reducing poverty in the region. Inequality, as I said just now, is just most countries are in the 30s and early 40s. The informality, as you can see there, is in the region of between 30, 40, 35, or average 35%, region down to 22. And of course, unemployment, because of variations in the measurement, is high, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, where we have some major challenges. And then the final area I want to focus on is the question of macroeconomic management. And this is probably the most challenging. As I said earlier, the economic development process is a long-term development process with a trend. And therefore, the challenge you have is trying to keep on that particular trend. But sometimes we have various shocks in the economic system which carries us away from that trend, and we need to get back on to that particular trend. And this is where the quality of our economic management becomes very critical in terms of dealing with the various economies. And we've seen, therefore, that over the past decade, several countries have found that they've been increasing their fiscal deficits, primarily as a result of having to deal with the Great Recession. And of course, and in the process of doing that, enhancing our fiscal deficits, we have also incurred significant debt to GDP ratios. And I'll give you a picture of that in a moment, especially in a condition where what this suggests is that Keynesian policies don't always work as well as they should in countries such as Georgia. And this has put certainly foreign exchange reserves under severe pressure, not only from volatile export prices, but more importantly, the fall in export demand that we from all our export sectors, tourism, and so on, bauxite and those types of things. Inflation has been moderate to a large extent. There have been spikes from time to time. And these particular macroeconomic challenges have forced several countries to seek development assistance from the IMF, economic assistance from the IMF, in order to cover their balance of payments challenges. What we've seen here, and I'll put up that slide in a moment. We can go to this one. Right. So this gives a sense of this particular slide. Gives you a sense of the debt to GDP ratios in the various countries of the region for 2013 and 2017. And you can see the ones in yellow are the countries that have experienced, had some sort of IMF assistance, either by means of standby or EFS or ECF. And what you see in Antigua, as you can see, the debt GDP ratio was 95% in 2013, and with IMF assistance, it's come down to 78. There's a question of what is the reasonable threshold for the region. Some people say 60, some people say 70. but certainly that is what it is. But it still has a problem in trying to generate enough primary surplus in the fiscal accounts to be able to manage. So it's still some issues in Antigua to deal with. Barbados, you can see, I don't have to tell you Barbados. You can see what, if you look at all the countries, if you compare, let's say, Barbados, Grenada, and St. Kitts, for example, you see where we are currently having our challenge. We should have gone to the IMF long time ago. We held back. This is where the politicians, when we go to advice for the politicians, and they give us a different view. You see, so when the economists say go, go. Don't wait on the politics. So now we have to deal with the major challenge in terms of debt restructuring and so forth that's going on. So Jamaica has been in the fund for as long as I've been in economics, I would think. I mean, they go in and out as a see, but they've been having their challenges. Trying even to get below 100 has been a challenge of them. Barbados, you can see, will have some tremendous challenge to bring it down even to 80, which is the target, and so on. And of course, the one that's missing on this that you can't quite see is Suriname. Suriname went into a program, but came out very quickly. I mean, they aborted it and decided to do the things on their own. So you see, I've given a list of the various programs, IMF lending arrangements that have been entered in, and the periods, most of them 3 years. Antigua had a standby. Barbados has just entered an extended fund facility for 4 years. Grenada has been into 2 programs, and is now, I think Grenada is now being regarded as the bright eye of the region in terms of IMF assistance and so on. And of course, Jamaica has been there for a long time. St. Kitts went in quickly. And almost all of these programs have had some serious debt restructuring as part of it, and has caused, certainly in the case of Barbados, some major challenges going ahead. In terms of the doing business experience, which is important for moving economic growth and so on, we've had some issues where there's been a deteriorating in the rankings over time between 2008 2017. There's been, I'll show that in a moment. But the region certainly has, in terms of doing business, has had some serious challenge in respect to some areas of activity which constrain the extent to which we've been able to advance in the significant way we had. Some of them will certainly be registering property, resolving insolvency, which are really part of the legal system. So you find that economists now have to deal with some legal issues. Getting credit is important, and I know Patrick has done a lot of work in the area of monetary and finance, and therefore those are some of the issues there. These are some tables. I'm not going to go into these tables in a serious way, but this gives you a sense of, I've used Singapore as an example. Here, where Singapore, in terms of distance from the frontier, when you think about how far you are, the higher the figure, the better it is in this particular regard. You see then that Singapore is at 84, and the region are well below Singapore in that particular region, in the 50s and 60s. So we see you have a long way to go in terms of doing business within the region to get anywhere near the Singapore and having the Singapore effect that we have. This is in relation to the various categories of work. So therefore, in terms of the development experience, there has been this ongoing balancing act that we've had between economic development, the long-term process of trying to improve people's lives, enhance their economic standing and so on, with the macroeconomic management and stabilization process that we've had due to primarily to these shocks. And that's always been that challenge that we find ourselves developing strategic development plans and then having to either abort them, change them rapidly, or just ignore them in some particular way because of these particular shocks. So we have, therefore, to bring back on board the issue of how then do we put economic development planning in a serious way on the table again. And I will use the Sustainable Development Goals as a basis for doing that. Now, I first outline a number of general challenges. I summarize those challenges in 2 ways. First, I provide some general challenges from a paper that was prepared by two writers, and I just listed them: climate change, volatile commodity, whole range are there. I won't go into them in any significant way. I want to focus on the next slide, which talks about the specific economic development challenges facing the region. So almost to summarize what I've had from the experiences. And as I said earlier, increasing productivity and breaking that middle income trap is probably a major and significant development challenge that we have. the question that we have is that we started out as very in some cases monocultural countries or economies, whether it's sugar in one hand or oil in the other. We started essentially with that particular focus, and the challenge we had is that those areas of activity, sector activity, allow us to get up a certain point, but not beyond. And now there's a lot of talk these days about the green economy, the blue economy, and the orange economy. So there's orange in there, Anne-Marie. And this is where we call what I call the diversification challenge that we have to. How do we diversify our economies in such a way that we can enhance our development process to move to that higher level of income that we really want to push at? And therefore, if we can do that, we'll be well on the way. In the most recent times, what the new change in government in Barbados, for example, has established a Ministry of Blue Economy. And they've also created one that incorporates, the actual title is Creative Economy. So you have a Blue Economy Minister and we have a Blue Economy Minister. So we'll see how those pan out in years to come. So that's a challenge. How do we diversify our economies in order to enhance our productivity and enhance our economic growth? The next challenge, of course, is reducing the public indebtedness and creating the fiscal space for promoting growth and development in the context of crowding in policies. This is not a situation where government, but providing government therefore becomes the agent for assisting with the development of the private sector rather than seeing itself as the development agent going forward. I think that's going to be a major challenge. Removing and streamlining government regulations and red tape, which increases the transactions cost of doing business. That's another challenge we have. We have to access to finance, development finance, increasing the capacity to advance and take advantage of various trade agreements. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that we engage, we have a range of trade agreements, EPAs, for example, the European one, and we take very little advantage of these things. Very little is done. I mean, if you ask, I remember when we were in Salisis, we did a study in Barbados about the knowledge and understanding of these trade agreements and in the private sector, business sector. And very few people knew about these things. And therefore, although we set up a unit in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and my old colleague and friend, who was minister at the time, it was like hitting against the wall. Nobody was able to get past the domestic sector. And that's where the problem is. They feel comfortable with the domestic environment, but not willing to go beyond that. Of course, there are challenges associated with some of these agreements in turn again, but that provides an impetus to go in the next step. Of course, building resilience in the infrastructure, and now there's a talk a lot about resilience, and developing resilience-based development is being employed, whether it is housing or whether it's in other types of infrastructure. Promoting regional economic cooperation and streamlining the immigration process. I was particularly pleased when I came in yesterday morning that I didn't get the mountain of questions coming into Trinidad that I used to get as PVC. I was just told that I just told them I've come for economics conference at the Department of Economics UWI. When am I going back? And that was it. I tell them what is the bottom of the form. Before I was interrogated, who am I coming to see? What's the number? Where am I staying? And all the other paraphernalia. So hopefully things are changing in Trinidad and Tobago. But that's a different story. But more importantly, I think we have to relook how we engage in economic integration, economic cooperation within the region. I think that's something that is a challenge. I know there's a meeting, as I will come to later on, in relation to the CSME. There's a meeting coming up, I think, early next month to relook with the new minister. We have a very energetic Prime Minister who has taken over the running of the CSME, the overseeing of the CSME, and therefore we need to see how we can do in that. And of course, synchronizing regional goals with global goals, which I'll come to in a moment. In many cases, these challenges are interrelated, and hence, therefore, we need a framework for resolving meeting these particular challenges that we're facing. And the framework, as I said, as I would outline earlier, it would be the Sustainable Development Goals that have been identified by the UN. So as I said, therefore, these challenges require coordination of macroeconomic stabilization management and also economic development policies and programs. The region has international obligations which must be taken into consideration, in this case, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17. We did fairly well with the Millennium Development Goals, and therefore what we need to do is to see the extent to which we can use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for going forward to 2013. Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica have already prepared development plans with a Vision 2030 in mind. Trinidad, of course, I haven't had a chance to look at the Jamaica one in detail, but I suspect it might not be as advanced. But since I'm in Trinidad and Tobago, I think you have moved well down the road, and I suspect, Terrence, you might have been responsible for this, unless I might be giving you credit that you're not doing, but I know you were involved in development council, it was, Economic Development Council. Which certainly has been linked, and I'll speak to that in a moment, linked to the sustainability goals to provide a framework. Because they're saying at the end of the day, we have to report on the SDGs. That is almost a fait accompli. Somewhere along the line, you will get the pressure to play, and therefore the question is, why do something on one side and not relate it to something nationally, especially when there's a relationship between the two? So these are the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, and the Millennium Development Goals, which are linked to that. I won't go into that in detail. And this is where Trinidad and Tobago has been able to, in its Vision 2030, link the Sustainable Development Goals to its own pillars in the strategic plan, in their own strategic development plan. And this is a good start, because you can see, therefore, when we come to report on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, you already been doing something that allows you to develop and formulate and resolve your own development problems within the region. So the argument I'm making here is that Sustainable Development Goals, suitably modified, of course, can provide a framework for achieving many of the development goals that we see ourselves and overcoming the challenges that we have to face in the region going forward. And as I said here, the interesting thing is that the region has agreed, and I put agreed in inverted commas, that they will focus on a subset of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I've outlined those in a moment. And the reason why this subset essentially focuses essentially on seeks to meet the various economic development challenges faced in the region. Growth, as I said, growth and productivity, poverty, human development, alternative energy, and so forth. And no time is against me. Now, these are the 12 goals, and I won't go into any detail. Now, there was a ECLAP meeting back in October 15, where representatives from the various countries in the region met, and they agreed to set 12 particular goals in the region that are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals out of the 17. And those are the first 6, and this is the next 6. And my argument, therefore, is that these particular goals can be used to help meet some of the challenges that we are facing on the economic development front. Some countries, as I said, have development plans which need certainly to be updated, reviewed, and so forth. And many of these plans have identified strategies and policies in the area of renewable energy, creative sector, and so on, which could form the basis of what I call the new economic and growth path for the region. Especially when we are now talking about the new economy, the knowledge economy, and the 4th industrial revolution. So the way forward then, as I see it, and coming to the end, is that there's need for a framework to deal with the economic development challenges facing the region. And that particular framework will certainly incorporate not the separate elements that I mentioned at the beginning, but will incorporate appropriate policies to guide the private sector, production and public sector activities, efficient and effective institutions, behavioral change, which I think is critical, and leadership at all levels. In my view, I think the Sustainable Development Goals can provide that particular framework. But what we need to do is to engage in another set of studies. I mean, we always studying. And the old people used to say, my mother and grandmother would tell you, if you study, you'll go mad after a while. But certainly, what we need to do is, rather than to engage in another series of studies, we need to assess these particular studies that have already been undertaken, see what information is needed to help us to design appropriate policies on the ground and programs and so on, rather than reinventing the wheel, in order to get ourselves forward. So you already have a wide range of studies that are available, and we need to get cracking going forward. And I think I use the example of Compete Caribbean as a case in point of something they came in, did a study, and then started a number of actions going forward. I think going forward, we need to recommit to strengthening the Caribbean single market economy and as a vehicle for its original intent, which was production integration, cluster development, and extra-regional marketing. It seems to me that Norman Gervin's paper on the single development vision has been disappeared somewhere. It is still very much online. But I think that needs to be relooked and entertained in terms of looking forward, trying to deal with some of the issues. I think we have to strengthen our economic integration movement in various forms. We don't want to perfection, but certainly to have much greater cooperation in the region. I think we need to achieve and maintain some degree of macroeconomic stability in the region, which is critical for economic growth, and I think countries now seeking development IMF assistance would be able to bring that stability back on board. I know there's a lot of talk about fiscal rules and so forth. I'm not a believer in fiscal rule for the simple reason that rules can be broken, especially when they involve government setting the rules for themselves. But that's a different story. We need, of course, in the way forward, review, upgrade, and prepare development plans, both I think which are based on agreed strategic the systemic development goals for the region. Some time ago, I was involved in a strategic plan for regional development, SPRD, which looked at this particular element, but that was abandoned by CARICOM and they adopted some other thing down the road, but that's a different story. We need to clarify the roles of the private sector, the government, and other stakeholders in the development process. I think sometimes the public sector gets a blow in the process, but the private sector doesn't. And therefore, it's like saying, therefore, the private sector, everything is perfect and dandy there, the problem is you on the other side. But clearly there are challenges within the private sector that we need to look at, and therefore we have to establish what is essentially their role in the process. So in developing this framework, certainly we need to develop strategies in the various areas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think if you develop strategies, and when you get a copy of the full presentation, you'll see where in the area of human resource development, the question of trading and marketing, development finance is a particular critical area that we need to find out how we're going to get this financing to do a number of things. In institutional reform, investment, innovation, entrepreneurship, human security, social protection, governance, implementation of more. I think this is probably the most important one. The last two, I think, are critical because they're areas that we have not paid enough attention to. One, implementation and monitoring, because we have this major implementation deficit. We talk a lot but do little. And of course, change management, I think, is critical. That is, as economists, we tend to say we need to do things, but we don't understand the behavioral process involved in doing those particular things. And I think the area of behavioral economics, which focuses a lot on psychology and link between psychology and economics, needs therefore to be brought much more onto the horizon than we have done in the culture that gets people doing things that we should. So in conclusion, therefore, I think the way forward in the region in meeting and overcoming the economic development challenges that we face will require, one, concrete action and less grandiose talk. I've said in almost every presentation I've made over the years that if we had to export talk in the region, we would be very, very rich, even richer than Trump's country. There's a strong political will and commitment. I know politicians have a 5-year horizon, and we have to be mindful of that and work with that. But we have to have the political will at the national and regional level to commit and go forward. We have to ensure that there's trust and partnership amongst the stakeholders. That is trust in what it is that we're doing and faith in what we have to do, and we have this sort of partnership between the various stakeholders involved. We have to be able to sequence our responses to these challenges in such a way that they make sense. Sometimes we do things that we thought we want to develop a creative economy, but we don't have the people to work in the creative economy yet. Or alternatively, we want to develop a blue economy, but we don't know where the blue economy workers are coming from. So it's a chicken and egg situation, which comes first? And I think we need to be able to develop our sequencing of policies and plans in order to make sure. That is, we know from microeconomics, there's a time to build, and it is time to train. And therefore, if you're talking about developing, if you want to have doctors in a particular economy, you can't say you want doctors tomorrow morning. It takes 5 years, 6 years to develop a doctor of a certain degree of competence. So the sequencing becomes important. Of course, the behavior change that I talk about, now this is a big challenge. How do we like it so? I don't know. Terence, you will tell you all this, how we're going to deal with these changes that we need to change in behavior. And of course, something that the Honorary has been focusing on over the years, and I want to finish on this, good information system, database, which becomes important for monitoring and evaluating policies over the thing. These are some useful references that I've identified that you might want to have a look at. Interesting, when I was finishing off the presentation, I saw in my inbox the IDB's most recent report, Caribbean Region Quarterly Bulletin. And what's its title? Economic Development Challenges in the Region, in the Caribbean. So they correspond with what I was going to say anyhow, so that takes care of my own side. So let me thank you for the invitation. I pay tribute, hopefully, to some of Patrick's work. I wish him all the very best in his retirement. We will join each other on a cruise one of these days, and we will have fun, and we will look forward to what the young economists and social scientists are doing to keep us retirees going happy ever after. Thank you very much.